There is a strange silence in old Soviet photographs. The faces are large, the gaze is confident, the caption is short. Revolutionary, diplomat, physicist, aircraft designer, director, actor. At first, it seems like the viewer is simply looking at a gallery of famous people. But if you look more carefully, another dimension appears behind those captions. Jewish origin. Sometimes it explains nothing about a person's talent, but it explains a great deal about how the system looked at that person. The Soviet Union could accept Jewish intellect, Jewish energy, Jewish discipline, and the Jewish contribution to science, war, cinema, theatre, and diplomacy. But too often, it did not want to accept Jewish memory as equal. It could award a person an order and then force him to remain silent. It could use a name on a poster, but fear a surname in a questionnaire. It could admire an achievement and, at the same time, suspect an origin. Today we will speak about 7 figures: Trotsky, Litvinov, Joffe, Landau, Lavochkin, Mikhoels, Eisenstein. This is not a list of the best and not a ranking of power. These are 7 different doors into the history of the Soviet Union. Revolution, diplomacy, peace negotiations, physics, military aviation, the Jewish stage, world cinema. And before this story begins in greater depth, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Topics like this are easy to distort, oversimplify, or hand over to propaganda. That is why it is important to speak here calmly, accurately, and with respect for memory. Leon Trotsky was born Lev Davidovich Bronstein in 1879 in the Kherson Governorate into a Jewish family. His family was not strictly religious, the home did not speak only Jewish languages, and Trotsky himself later built his life not around Jewish tradition, but around revolutionary ideology. But for anti-Semitic propaganda, none of this mattered. It did not need nuance. It needed an image. Trotsky became one of the most visible faces of the revolution. He was People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, then People's Commissar for Military Affairs, and one of the creators of the Red Army. His influence in the early years of Soviet power was enormous. He did not simply write texts. He helped build the machinery of power, the army, and mobilization. And here begins the central moral knot of this subject. Yes, among the Bolsheviks there were people of Jewish origin, but turning that fact into an accusation against the entire Jewish people is historically illiterate and morally dangerous. Jews were not a single political organism. Among Jews there were Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, Zionists, religious people, opponents of the revolution, and people who wanted only one thing: for their families to be left alone. The anti-Semitic myth tried to turn individual biographies into collective guilt. But reality was more complicated and more tragic. The same Soviet system in which Trotsky rose so high later crushed countless Jews: writers, doctors, engineers, party workers, ordinary people with a dangerous fifth line in their documents. Trotsky himself also became an enemy of the system. In 1927, he was expelled from the party. In 1929, he was exiled from the Soviet Union. And in 1940, he was murdered in Mexico by an agent of Stalin's regime. The man who helped build the Soviet project was destroyed by that very same project. Alongside Trotsky in early Soviet history stood Adolf Abramovich Joffe. Today, his name is heard much less often, although in his time he was one of the most important diplomats of the revolution. He was born in Simferopol in 1883, studied in Europe, was connected with Trotsky, took part in the revolutionary movement, and after October 1917 headed the Soviet delegation at the negotiations with Germany in Brest-Litovsk. Imagine that scene. Winter, a negotiating table. Empires are collapsing on the map. On one side sit representatives of Germany and Austria-Hungary. On the other side are people who only yesterday had been underground activists, exiles, emigrants. and among them is Joffe, a man who must speak on behalf of a new power that is not yet certain of its own tomorrow. Later, he served as the Soviet representative in Germany, took part in negotiations with Poland and the Baltic states, and was ambassador to China, Austria, and Japan. This was not the diplomacy of ceremonial halls, but the diplomacy of a world after catastrophe. But his fate, too, ended in the shadow of inner-party struggle. Joffe supported the left opposition, was connected with Trotsky, and was pushed aside. In 1927, after Trotsky's defeat, Joffe took his own life, leaving behind a letter. His biography reminds us that the early Soviet Union was created not only by loud leaders, it was also created by those who later disappeared from memory because they lost the struggle inside the system itself. Maxim Litvinov was another face of Jewish influence in the Soviet Union. Not the revolutionary tribune, but the diplomatic office. Not the armored train, but negotiations. Not the poster, but the protocol. He was born Meir Woloch in Bialystok in 1876 into a Jewish family. Later, he took the name Maxim Litvinov. In the 1930s, he became People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union and one of the main advocates of the policy of collective security. That phrase sounds dry, but its meaning was vital. To create a system of alliances against Nazi Germany, and to prevent Europe from sliding into another major war, one country at a time. Litvinov worked for the recognition of the Soviet Union by the United States, supported treaties, international mechanisms of deterrence, and cooperation with Western powers against the Nazi threat. In 1939, he was removed from his post. Soon after that, the Soviet-German Pact was signed. For the Nazi leadership, Litvinov's Jewish origin was not a biographical detail, but an ideological irritant. For Stalin's system, it was also a dangerous mark, especially when the post-war campaign against cosmopolitans began. And here lies the terrible irony. A man who warned about the danger of Nazism and searched for anti-Hitler alliances lived in a country where his origin could become a political disadvantage. We've reached the middle of this story. If you are watching not just out of curiosity, but to remember names, write in the comments which of these people you already knew. And support the video with a like. That is how complex historical topics like this get a chance to reach the people who truly need them. Now, Lev Landau. In 1908, in Baku, a boy was born into a family of Jewish origin, a boy who began understanding mathematics too early. By the age of 14, he had already entered university. Later, he became one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century. Landau approached theoretical physics almost the way a musician approaches sound. For him, formulas were not dry symbols, but a way to see the hidden order of the world. He worked in quantum theory, low-temperature physics, superfluidity, plasma physics, and phase transitions. In 1962, he received the Nobel Prize in Physics for his theories of condensed matter, especially liquid helium. But behind the brilliant scientific biography stood another Soviet reality. In 1938, Landau was arrested. He was accused of anti-Soviet activity. He was released after the intervention of Pyotr Kapitsa, who effectively took responsibility for him. One can imagine the office, the letter, the careful wording, the fear behind every word. A scientist needed by the country, yet still someone who could disappear into a prison cell. That was the Soviet logic. Talent did not always save a person. Sometimes it only made him more visible. Semyon Lavochkin shows another side of influence, war and engineering labor. He was born in Smolensk in 1900 into a Jewish family. His father was a teacher. Lavochkin himself became an aircraft designer, a man whose decisions during the war were turned not into articles, but into machines on which pilots' lives depended. The LA-5 and LA-7 fighters became an important part of Soviet aviation during the Great Patriotic War. According to the enterprise that bears his name, around 22,500 Lavochkin-designed fighters were produced during the war. Ivan Kozhedub, one of the most successful pilots of the anti-Hitler coalition, who shot down 62 enemy aircraft, flew such machines. This kind of influence does not look like a speech from a podium. It looks like a drafting table, a night in a design bureau. Engineers sleeping only a few hours, wood, metal, engine, tests, crashes, corrections. War did not ask about a plane's origin in the sky. But after the war, origin could once again become a question in a form, in an office, in an invisible assessment of a person. Lavochkin received titles, prizes, and recognition, and yet his biography is important precisely because it returns a Jewish name to a place where it was often dissolved into the general Soviet formula. Our designers, our aviation, our victory. Behind that victory were specific people. Among them was the Jewish engineer Semyon Lavochkin. And now, the stage. The Moscow State Jewish Theatre, the light of the footlights, a language that in some homes sounded like childhood, and in others was already becoming a dangerous memory. On stage stands Solomon Mikhoels. He was born in 1890 in Dvinsk, today Daugavpils in Latvia. His real name was Shloime Vovsi. He became a great actor, director, and artistic leader of the Jewish theatre in Moscow. For Soviet Jews, Mikhoels was not simply an artist. He was the voice of a culture that was allowed to exist as long as it was useful. During the war, Mikhoels headed the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. The committee was supposed to appeal to Jews around the world, especially Jews in the United States and Great Britain, to support the struggle against Nazism. During the war years, Soviet power was ready to speak with world Jewry. It was useful. But after the war, that same connection became suspicious. In 1948, Mikhoels was killed in Minsk. His death was presented as a car accident. Later, historians and published materials show that it was a political murder connected to Stalin's campaign against Jewish public and cultural life. After Mikhoels came a new silence. Arrests, interrogations, accusations of nationalism. In 1952, 13 members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee were executed. This event later became known as the Night of the Murdered Poets, although among those killed were not only poets, but writers, actors, scholars, and public figures. The system did not simply kill people. It tried to turn Jewish memory itself into a crime. The final figure is Sergei Eisenstein. With him, one must speak especially carefully. He was the son of a father of Jewish origin who had converted to Christianity, and a mother of non-Jewish origin. Eisenstein himself did not present Jewish identity as the main public foundation of his life. But Jewish origin on his father's side is present in serious biographical sources, and therefore he can be considered in this topic cautiously, without appropriation and without simplification. Eisenstein was born in Riga in 1898. He became the man who changed the language of cinema. Battleship Potemkin made montage not merely a technical device, but a way of thinking. Its shots of the Odessa steppes entered world film history. Alexander Nevsky became an important film of the late 1930s. Ivan the Terrible collided with censorship. The second part of the film was banned and was released only after Stalin's death. Eisenstein shows another facet of the Soviet fate. Even a genius recognized around the world remained inside a system where art was considered not free-breathing, but an instrument of the state. He could be a master, but not the master of his own silence. And if these 7 names are placed side by side, what emerges is not a conspiracy, not a myth, and not a simple legend of success. What emerges is a complex map of the Soviet Union. Trotsky, the power of revolution and its self-destruction. Joffe, the diplomacy of the first years and the tragedy of those who lost inside the system. Litvinov, an attempt to stop a European catastrophe through collective security. Landau, a scientific genius who could be saved only by the courage of another scientist. Lavochkin, an engineer whose aircraft helped fight Nazism. Mikhoels, Jewish culture, first needed by the state and then declared dangerous. Eisenstein, a world language of cinema created by a man of complex origin and an even more complex fate. What is important to remember from this story? First, Jews in the Soviet Union were not one political force, but millions of different people with different views, professions, fears, and hopes. Second, Jewish origin could be an unnoticed detail in years of success and a dangerous mark in years of suspicion. Third, the Soviet system often accepted the contribution of Jews, but did not always accept their right to open memory. Fourth, anti-Semitic myths always simplify history because they need not facts, but culprits. Fifth, returning names means protecting history from lies. These people were not saints, and they were not symbols without contradictions. Some took part in creating a harsh system. Some became its victims. Some lived between recognition and fear. But all of them show how deeply Jewish biographies are woven into the history of the 20th century. And that is why this story must be told not with hatred, but with memory. Because propaganda loves turning people into labels, history must return their faces to them. If you watched until the end, write the code word NAMES in the comments. Let there remain under this video not just a reaction, but a small sign of memory for those whose names were too often spoken without their true history.